The talk is drawn in part from a chapter of this monograph that Michelle mentioned that I'm working on, the title of which, at least right now, is tentatively Planned Obsolescence, Scholarly Publishing in the Future of the Academy. And what I'm arguing in the monograph as a whole is that, first of all, that scholarly publishing in some form must move online, that we really, in order for the processes that we think of as scholarly communication to survive into the future because of the economics that scholarly publishing is currently being crushed under, we really need to start thinking about the digital in a much more serious way. But the ultimate argument of this monograph is not that we need to change our technologies in order to do so, but that first we have a whole series of processes of social and institutional change that have to precede that technological change. And so what are the things about our ways of thinking about our work and our ways of existing and communicating with our work that we really need to be thinking about? So this is one of the chapters from this project that is attempting to think about this particular networked textual structure as being a fundamentally social structure. So I will just launch into this here. The talk today is going to explore one relatively new publishing technology, as I say, and my experiments with it as a means of making the argument that scholarly publishing units, and within that rubric I want to include both university presses and university libraries that are increasingly getting involved in digital publishing projects such as institutional repositories and so forth, will benefit from thinking less about the dissemination of discrete digital texts than about the development and implementation of tools that can help reimagine scholarly publishing as a fundamentally social process, one meant to serve the interconnections and discussions of authors and readers. The success of the scholarly publishing ventures of the future will likely hinge on the liveliness of the connections and interactions that these publishing ventures can produce and the further new writing that they wind up inspiring. So, on July 25th, 2007, the Institute for the Future of the Book released version 1.0 of CommentPress, which is the theme for WordPress that facilitates the web publication of lengthy documents in a fashion that's both internally and externally networked, and that allows for reader commenting and discussion at a range of levels of granularity. The goal of CommentPress, as the project's About page describes it, stems from the desire, quote, to see whether a popular net-native publishing forum, the blog, which most would agree is very good at covering the present moment in pithy conversational bursts, but lousy at handling larger, slow-developing works requiring more than chronological organization, whether this forum might be refashioned to enable social interaction around long-form texts. So I was asked to beta test CommentPress before its release, and in the process I got interested enough in the project to start writing about it. And over the course of the summer, this last summer, I drafted an article called CommentPress, curiously enough, New Social Structures for New Network Texts. I posted it online in CommentPress, and then I revised the article based on the discussion that it provoked. And in October of last year, the article was simultaneously published in the Journal of Electronic Publishing and on Media Commons, again as a CommentPress document that was open for discussion. And some of what follows is a set of conclusions that are reached within the article itself, and some is the thought that's based on the process of drafting, revising, and publishing the article. And ultimately, what interests me most in this project is CommentPress's connection of an experiment into the organization of digital texts with a desire to promote social interaction with and around these texts, a connection that offers an important resituation, I think, of the problem of electronic publishing away from a page-level interest in the production of readable screen-based text and toward a more complex understanding of the structures that underlie long-form texts. So this project compels a look backward, or a new perspective, I should say, on certain aspects of the historical development of publishing, taking this backward look as a means of considering the significance of a project like CommentPress, which should be understood in this context not as the apotheosis of electronic publishing, but just as one fruitful example of a potential avenue for development of the future of textuality online. So this look backward begins with a talk given by Peter Stallybrass at the 2006 MLA, which he began with a rather startling claim, So in asking who exactly is responsible for the production of the thing that we know of as the book, he overturned several basic assumptions about that form's production that are often unconsciously held both by literary scholars and textual critics. And contrary to popular belief, he argued, authors do not write books, suggesting instead that authors write sentences, or perhaps on a larger scale texts. But neither do printers produce books. Printers instead produce pages. And Stallybrass's argument in this context was that textual studies scholars need to refocus their interests on the page as the unit of print production, since the vast majority of print production across print's history has really been in isolated pages rather than in book-like objects, as a means of escaping what he called the tyranny of the book. But the associated point that it's in fact the binders who are ultimately responsible for producing the thing that we know of as the book suggests that the bookness of the book results less from its material composition, from ink on paper, than from its larger organization, the sequenced, bound, and cut leaves that form the codex. Right? It is, as Stallybrass has argued elsewhere, the shift from the scroll to the codex form that enabled the book's capacity for random access, allowing a reader to turn immediately to any particular point in a text, thus facilitating the reader's active engagement in and manipulation of the textual object. And there's thus a very deep irony embedded in the fact that as we go to digital publishing, we wind up going back to scrolling. Right? We lose that random access on some level. And if this is the case, if the formal properties of the book that have had the greatest impact on our reading experience are derived not from print but from the codex, one might suggest that researchers working on new ways of transforming ink on paper to pixels on screens may be working on the wrong problem, or at least on the wrong aspect of a slightly knottier problem than it may have at moments appeared. Recognizing this may be crucial for the development of truly web-native publishing modes, as most of the forms in which digital texts currently circulate, such as ebooks, for instance, or portable documents, or web pages, can be seen in their very names to suffer from what Paul Levinson, following Marshall McLuhan, has referred to as the rear-view mirrorism that rules early stages of innovation, in which we have difficulty defining new technologies except in terms of old ones, right? Thus giving us the horseless carriage or the wireless. In electronic publishing, our rear-view mirrorism ties our digital experiments to the established print-based models that have been critically important to the development of Western thought over the last 600 years. However, simply attempting to translate these established forms to the screen requires sacrificing paper's advantages while failing to take full advantage of the affordances of multimodal network technologies. And the result of this is that most of these digital textual forms become a sort of paper under glass, right? Readable, certainly, but forbidding the kinds of interactions that paper allows, such as underlining or marginalia or random access, but also forbidding the kinds of interaction that recent web development have fostered, such as linking or commenting or versioning and so forth. And to be clear, the development of forms that replicate the readability of ink on paper for pixels on screens was an absolutely necessary precondition for the kinds of experimental publishing structures that I'm interested in. And yet, I'm still convinced that the concept of the e-book is destined to sound naive in the future, a remnant of our thus far tenuous toe dipping into digital publishing. Now, some part of that naivete arises from the indication that we have not yet found the net native structure that will be as flexible and inviting to individual readers as the codex has been. The absence that ebook highlights is not the means of moving from imprinting ink on paper to arranging pixels on screens, but the means of organizing and presenting digital texts in a structural sense, right? In a way that produces the greatest possible readerly and writerly engagement that enables both the intensive development of an idea within the bounds of the electronic text and the extensive situation of that idea within a network of other such ideas and texts. And this is where I turn to some of the stuff Michelle was talking about hypertext, right? Hypertext is one of the few modes of really radical experiment in textual form to which the digital has thus far given birth. This networked data structure created the possibility of really dramatically reorganizing text in net native ways, delinearizing and interlinking the text both within its own boundaries and in relationship to other such texts. And numerous literary authors and critics saw the future in early hypertext publishing, envisioning the a means of creating a new, more active mode of reading, right? One that would bring into being all of the things that had been dreamed about in literary theory for decades before. One that might lead to the leveling of the previously hierarchical relationship between author and reader, elevating the reader to full participation in the production of the text's meaning. But there is that dirty little secret, right? That hypertext can be very unfun to read. And it can also, as Michelle pointed out, be very unfun to teach. I mean, my students do have this visceral reaction every time I introduce them to hypertext. I'll have one or two who get really excited about it, and the rest of them just really hate it. They don't know what to do with it. And some of what they resist in hypertext can be attributed to a general appearance of datedness that most of the classic hypertexts now have. These are screenshots of Michael Joyce's Afternoon, of course, which, as you see, is copyright 1987 in this edition. And the datedness arises in no small part from the fact that after 7 years, Eastgate Systems, publisher of the most important hypertexts, still hasn't ported these crucial story space composed texts to OS X native formats, right? So up until now, they've had to be run in classic mode, which is what you're seeing here. This is classic. But classic has been rendered completely obsolete in the last few months through Apple's move first to Intel processors that can't boot into OS 9, and then the elimination of classic support in the newest OS Leopard, right? So classic is now gone. When I made this point in the draft version of this chapter that was originally posted in CommentPress, Mark Bernstein, who is the president of Eastgate Systems, popped by to comment and informed me that the hypertexts were still perfectly well readable in Windows. Which I just found fascinating. Anyway, this is a problem in digital publishing that really deserves some serious consideration, right? There's a creeping material obsolescence that's created by the onward march of technologies, which really demands that those of us interested in digital publishing also think on the front end about these issues of preservation and portability of the texts that we publish. But the resistance that I encounter in my students to hypertext really goes beyond these difficulties in accessing these texts, or their obviously really dated presentation. What my students most often voice, as Michelle pointed out, is their sense of disorientation within the text. They sort of stab randomly at it, trying to find their way somewhere. They wander aimlessly, trying to make sense of their paths, and then they finally give up, not at all sure how much of the text they've actually read or what they should have taken from it. And this isn't just a matter of laziness. Students of mine who've been willing to rough it through the confusions of a text like Gravity's Rainbow have felt stymied by Afternoon. And part of it is just literally about that sticking your finger in the text and knowing, okay, I have 600 pages of this book left to go, right? Which at least presumes an endpoint. Afternoon gives you no way of kind of measuring what's left, right? So they're unable to discern from the text the most basic rules of its comprehension. And I'm really unconvinced that the problem is just technophobia. One of the other issues that my students point to in their complaints about the hypertext form is feeling manipulated. Hypertext pretends to be interactive, they say. It only gives the illusion of reader involvement, and certainly only the illusion that the hierarchy of author and reader has been leveled. As Michelle pointed out, clicking, they insist, is not the same as writing. And in fact, hypertext caters not to the navigational and compositional desires of the reader, but to the thought processes of the author, right? So it becomes even more than the book, this need to discern what it was the author was thinking when they put these two particular lexia together. The Memex, after all, was originally imagined in Vannevar Bush's classic essay, As We May Think, not as a technology through which readers would encounter a single text, but as a means for researchers to organize their thoughts about multiple texts and to share those thoughts with other researchers. Similarly, Ted Nelson describes the original idea of his Xanadu project as having been the production of a file for writers and scientists. So the we doing the thinking in both Bush's and Nelson's visions was thus the author and his descendants, and not average readers. Experiments in hypertext, I would thus argue, point in the general direction of a digital publishing future, but they're finally hampered by having awakened in readers a desire for further participation that hypertext itself really can't satisfy. And for this reason, I want to suggest that if we're going to make any real headway in bridging the gap between our evident abilities with respect to arranging pixels on screens and the difficulties that remain with organizing texts in digital environments, in moving away from thinking about electronic publishing as a problem revolving around the future of print, and instead thinking of it as a problem revolving around the future of the codex, we need to refocus our attention on a different aspect of the digital network. And this is where the structural innovations of a project like CommentPress become particularly important for me. Now, lots of research has been done on the means of situating the text within a technological network, on making text digitally transmissible, comfortably readable on screen, and so forth. And all of this is a necessary precursor to the problem on which the developers of CommentPress chose to focus, which is the need to situate that same text within a social network, within the community of readers who wish to interact with the text and with one another through and around the text. So texts, after all, have never really operated in isolation from their readers, and readers have never been fully isolated from one another. But different kinds of textual structures have given rise to and interacted with different kinds of communication circuits. Newspapers and pamphlets, for instance, as most famously studied by Jürgen Habermas and Benedict Anderson, developed their influence in close concert with the rise of coffeehouse culture, in which the events and politics of the day were discussed and debated, thus giving rise not simply to a Habermasian sense of the public sphere, but to a sense of the public inhabiting that sphere, the imagined community of the nation. Books similarly moved within a set of social and communal structures that greatly affected their reception and comprehension, including libraries and reading groups. And there's wonderful work out there by Leah Price, for instance, about the dramatic shifts over time from book reading as a public and communal enterprise to a more individual enterprise. At any rate, these libraries and reading groups not only assisted readers in the selection of texts, but also provided space for their discussion. That said, the technology of the book and the literate public with which it interacted produced this general trend that Price and Eisenstein and others have written about toward individualizing the reader, right? Shifting the predominant mode of reading from a communal reading aloud to a more isolated, silent mode of consumption. And it is this isolated mode of reading that overwhelmingly dominates our sense of book reading today, particularly the form of reading done by scholars, right? The library model of textual circulation, once understood to be a communal enterprise, now comes to seem profoundly individualistic. Books are checked out and read by one person at a time in retreat from interaction with the world. And indeed, when we imagine scholarly interactions with the bulk of printed text today, particularly within the humanities, the primary images that arise are of isolation. Individual scholars hunched separately over bound texts, each working alone. Now, the scholars, of course, need to read and reflect in relative silence and retreat in order to understand and process the texts with which they work, as well as to produce more texts from those understandings. But the isolated aspect of this mode of reading has come to dominate our sense of the practice of reading as a whole, and in so doing, the scholar has come to partake of the myth of the individual genius, in which the great man produces noble ideas wholly from within his own intellectual resources. And what this notion, or what this understanding of the operation of scholarship ignores, of course, is the ways that the communal lingers in the circuit, if only in submerged ways, right? The scholar reading a book is never wholly alone, but is always in conversation with that book's author. Now, this conversation takes place at a glacial pace, as years elapse between thought and utterance in the form of the book's publication and between utterance and response in the form of reviews or responses to that book, but it is a conversation nonetheless. And the point here is that in attempting to reproduce the form of the book electronically, technologists have for too long focused on the isolated practice of reading, right? The individual reader alone with a screen, rather than the communal practices of discussion and debate to which those practices, or at least on some level, meant to give rise. Right? Scholars operate in a range of conversations, from classroom conversations with students to conference conversations with colleagues. Scholars need to have available to them not simply the library model of text circulating amongst individual readers, but also the coffeehouse model of public reading and debate. And this interconnection of individual nodes into a collective fabric is, of course, the strength of the network, which not only binds individual machines, but also has the ability to bring together the users of these machines at their separate workstations into one communal whole. Now, there's nothing particularly revolutionary in this insight. The network can create virtual connections amongst otherwise isolated individuals is little more than the kind of utopian thinking that's colored internet studies since Howard Rheingold's The Virtual Community was first published in 1993. And my interest in thinking about the social network and the structure of online text should not be read as suggesting that the social network that such wired community will solve all of the problems of contemporary scholarly publishing. But I do want to argue that understanding the ways that texts circulate within and give rise to communities will be a necessary component of creating a successful electronic publishing venture. And this, finally, I want to say is the strength of CommentPress, right? The project recognizes that on the one hand, simply publishing texts online, finding ways to replicate the structures of the book in digital form is insufficient because the network cannot and really should not replicate the codex. And that, on the other hand, simply moving toward an internally networked form of publishing like hypertext will likewise not revolutionize the circulation of texts because the emphasis remains on the individual text, the individual author, the individual mind. As Richard Lanham noted in an early review essay on work in electronic textuality, digital electronic writing is a volatile, interactive, non-authoritative medium which of itself alters the whole idea of scholarly originality, research, and production and publication. But such transformations will only take root if the medium's interactivity and non-authoritative structures are fully mobilized. And it's no paradox that my students resist hypertext while embracing Facebook, the folks celebrated by Time magazine as the person of the year in late 2006. Expects that the reader will likewise be allowed to write. And it's not just students. The rise of academic blogging, both by individual scholars and amongst groups of scholars, seems to suggest the hunger that many scholars feel for ongoing interactions around textual production. A number of scholars have likened the interactions that take place in and around scholarly blogs to the coffee houses and salons of previous eras. But what I want to suggest is that network interactions and connections of the types provided by blog engines can revitalize academic discourse not just in its pamphlet coffeehouse mode, but also in its book library mode, by facilitating discussion of a text, by promoting that discussion within the text's own frame, and by manifesting the ways that each individual text is and always has been in dialogue with numerous texts that have preceded it and with those that are yet to come. So many experiments focused on the adaptation of such web-based technologies to scholarly publishing are currently underway, including my own project, Media Commons, which has grown out of two parallel convictions. First, that something in the current system of academic publishing is broken, and that radical change will be necessary to fix it. And second, that the purposes of such publishing must be regrounded in the desire for communication amongst a body of scholarly peers. There are a number of problems that Media Commons must work out, however, before it can spring fully to life. Among these, of course, number the very, very insignificant institutional problems of peer review and credentialing, particularly in this experimental open network environment, but also, and most crucially for the purposes of this talk, the problem of structure. Right, of devising ways to publish long articles and even monographs online in engaging, readable formats. Now, the Institute for the Future of the Book has proven an ideal partner in this venture, as their collective thinking about publishing's future has circled around ways to facilitate the transition not just from pages to screens, but into the network itself, into this community, imagining new structures like CommentPress that can enable conversation in and around digitally published texts. So CommentPress originated in the design worked out by the Institute for their version of Mackenzie Wark's book, Gamer Theory, of which this is a screenshot. Wark's style of writing really lent itself to this form, in part because he writes in paragraphs rather than longer chunks to begin with. And he produced this text as well within a rigidly algorithmic structure in which 9 alphabetically sequential chapters, so you see those across the top, each containing 25 paragraphs, and each paragraph with an absolute word limit of 250 words, all came together, right? So the text is already pre-chunked, and so it lent itself to this kind of environment. And as the paragraphs were somewhat aphoristic, you see what's, for my money, the most interesting and yet most depressing paragraph from the text. Many of them stood alone well, and reader comments were thus able to be closely associated with each paragraph of the text. However, the translation of what was really originally supposed to be a codex book into this nonlinear format created some complications. I mean, each paragraph looks a bit more freestanding than it really is. A reader can't simply enter and exit the text at any given point. Readers often wound up leaving questions or comments on early chunks about issues that were addressed in later parts of the text, and you see in the comments work getting increasingly testy about that. It's kind of an interesting study. At any rate, publishing works text online was extraordinarily labor intensive, which is the other problem. This format was designed precisely for this text, and it required tremendous amounts of manual tweaking and way too much to be readily adaptable for more general purposes. But CommentPress was further developed after this experiment through a series of follow-on experiments with authors and editors, including Mitchell Stevens, whose article Holy of Holies was imagined as a networked working paper, and Louis Lapham, with whom the Institute published a commentable version of the Iraq Study Group report. Now, all of these, this was actually a very interesting project. It has a caveat, however. All of these experiments work to promote dialogue within and around long-form texts in two primary ways. First, by structuring these texts around chunks that can be interlinked in linear and nonlinear fashions, and that can take advantage of the ability to link to and receive links from other texts in the network. And second, by allowing those chunks to be commented and discussed at various levels of granularity, ranging from, and this is back to my own article draft, ranging from the document as a whole to the page, and then all the way down to the individual paragraph. Now, not all CommentPress experiments thus far have been successful, as some texts published in this form have received more comment than discussion than others. Holy of Holies, for instance, received 104 comments, and it's really not that long a paper. In part, though, because Mitchell Stevens had already developed a readership through his ongoing blog, which then followed him over to the article when he announced it. The Lapham project, while arguably far more important, far more provocative, and certainly far longer, actually received fewer comments than did the Stevens article, in part because those participating in the experiment were really unaccustomed to this new mode of reading and discussion. The Institute and Lapham worked together to put together a cluster of really sort of big-name policy-type folks to comment and discuss in this space, and only one of them had any online presence. So the total report got something like 92 comments, 35 of which come from that one guy who has the online presence, who is comfortable working in this environment, right? So this is to say that no technology will be a panacea for scholarly communication. And even the most ingenious new structures for publishing a text online will not automatically get any group of readers talking. But technologies like these can, however, facilitate discussions among those who are both motivated and prepared to have them, among local clusters or existing societies of folks who really want to talk about work that they're doing in common. And academic authors, unsurprisingly, often want to talk. After the first successful experiments with CommentPress, the Institute started getting numerous requests from authors who were hoping to use the templates to publish their papers. So this growing demand spurred them to go on and compile the various hacks and templates they had put together into a releasable, documented open source theme that is easily installable and usable with any WordPress installation. CommentPress 0.9, which was a development release, was first made available on July 21st, 2001. And the following day, I used my web hosting provider's one-click install function to load a new installation of WordPress, installed and set up the CommentPress theme, loaded in the draft text of the article, did a bit of tinkering with formatting and the like, and wound up taking this article from a draft Word document to published, whatever that now means, and open for discussion in under 3 hours. Since July, the Institute has advanced CommentPress to release 1.4. They've added a number of features along the way. It's now fully widget-friendly, if that matters. And it provides currently 2 skins from which users can select, one of which is more traditionally blog-like, in which excerpts from posts appear in reverse chronological order on the site's front page, and one is more document-structured, which presents a table of contents in forward chronological order on the front page linked to each of the document's sections. And in either skin, comments can be read in multiple modes, right? A reader can click on a small dialogue bubble you can see up to the right of the highlighted gray part to read comments on that particular paragraph, or a combination page bubble icon next to the page's title to read comments on the whole page. Readers can also browse comments, all the comments, either organized by commenter or by section of the text. And browsing this way in both forms, both by comment or by section of the text, gives you links, go to thread right there underneath the comment, back to the spot in the text where the original comments were made. Most excitingly, however, CommentPress has been released as open source, as I mentioned, which has not only helped get the theme quickly into use. One might see, for instance, the CommentPress version of the Ithaca Report, University Publishing in a Digital Age, but has also encouraged other developers to modify the theme in ways that will enrich the possibilities that CommentPress presents for electronic publishing. Such an update of CommentPress is currently underway. Though currently, this is January, very slow in internet time. And version 2.0 of the software, however, which is transforming the WordPress theme into a full-fledged plugin, is expected soon. Now, the new version is being developed in conjunction with Noah Wardrop-Froen, who Michelle mentioned earlier, who has recently conducted an experiment with the blog-based review of his book manuscript, Expressive Processing. This modification of CommentPress allows bloggers to use its discussion functions within their own themes, right, within an existing theme, creating freer design possibilities. And it also should allow authors to designate certain categories or subsets of posts as CommentPress enabled, thus allowing for discussable documents like these to exist within larger, more traditional blog structures. So this is one of the expressive processing posts on Grand Text Auto. This exists within the normal blog structure, but only the CommentPress enabled posts have the comments by paragraph and to the right of the text. Otherwise, the comments are in more traditional beneath the post spaces. Further avenues for development will hopefully allow for the coordinated publication of multiple texts, right, whether by individuals or by groups of authors, permitting the development of electronic journals or volumes in which individual texts are linked together. Now, the discussion spaces provided by CommentPress could be used by authors who, as I did, want feedback while a text is in draft form, but they could also be used by authors like Noah who have completed a text and are seeking peer review. Thus helping to create the sort of peer-to-peer review system that we at at Media Commons hope to develop. I have another chapter which is on this peer review issue. I would be happy to talk about that some if you're interested. Moreover, the pingback feature of WordPress is not as yet fully implemented in CommentPress. It sort of works and it sort of doesn't. But with a bit of future development, text published in this format will be easily linked with one another, with inbound links visible as another mode of commentary on the text, and thus another metric of its significance in the field. And this is one of the things that I think is most exciting about this kind of networked structure. The possibility not just of tracing a conversation backward in time through works cited and footnotes, but also tracking a conversation forward in time, finding out who has commented and written about things in future publications. However, what shouldn't be overlooked in any evaluation of a new publishing form such as this one is the quantity of labor that it requires. And that's not just in the development and installation and implementation of the software itself, which presents its own problems. The release of WordPress 2.3 broke several aspects of CommentPress's implementation. It took a while for them to get CommentPress updated, so they're now in release 1.4.1, which actually does work with WordPress 2.3. But WordPress is now about to release 2.5, and one can only imagine something new is going to break. So there's this ongoing problem with maintaining the software. There's also the maintenance of the design and release of texts that come through it, and the design and release of texts through it, but also the maintenance of those texts post-publication that creates a tremendous amount of labor. And not least of that is the active participation that discussion requires of the text's authors. And comments and trackbacks are, at least for the present, really insecure technologies. And they demand a certain degree of moderation, at least in order to ensure spam prevention. And these technologies of interaction really function best when the author actually desires the interaction, when the author is actually there conversing with the community that's discussing the text. And this is another issue that we saw with the distinction between Mitchell Stevens' Holy of Holies and the Lafoam version of the Iraq Study Group report. Mitchell was looking for feedback and was asking questions of commenters, which provoked more discussion. The Iraq Study Group really didn't care so much, oddly enough. Publishing systems like CommentPress thus aren't going to relieve institutions of the sort of infrastructural demands that are posed by current analog press and library systems, and they're also going to create more work for authors who aren't going to be quite so easily able to walk away from a manuscript at that stage and leave its publication to someone else. And as I noted earlier with respect to hypertext, the problem of technological obsolescence remains, though the fact that WordPress is able to export to XML will help texts published in this form remain portable. More than anything, though, CommentPress demonstrates the fruitfulness, for me, of reimagining the technologies of electronic publishing in service to the social interconnections of readers and authors. The success, in summary, of the electronic publishing ventures of the future, whether it's the digital initiatives of scholarly presses or the repositories that are being imagined by libraries, will likely hinge on the liveliness of the conversations and interactions that they can produce and the further new writing that results from those interactions. CommentPress grows out of this kind of understanding, that the chief problem in creating the future of the book is not simply placing the words on the screen, but structuring their delivery in a broader sense in an engaging manner. And this issue of engagement is not just, again, about locating the text within the technological network, but also and primarily about locating it within the social network. And these are the problems that I've been arguing that developers really must focus on in seeking the electronic form that can not just rival, but outdo the codex, as a form that invites the reader in, that acknowledges that the reader wants to respond, and that understands that all publication is part of an ongoing series of public conversations conducted in multiple time registers across multiple texts. Making those conversations as accessible and inviting as possible should be the goal in imagining the textual communication circuit of the future. Thank you.